I had a professor who said that we don't learn from our experiences, we only learn from the experiences that we reflect upon. And so now as I sit here in June 2021, I've been finding it really helpful for me in the last few weeks, and I'm going to continue to try to do this throughout the summer, to look back on the last 14, 15 months, like back to March 2020, and just to reflect upon my experiences, to reflect upon what I've been through, what we've been through, I've been through like in my church, reflect on what we've been through culturally and existentially, and just try to make sense of that and to find the threads throughout, to see what maybe God's been up to look at how I've changed over the course of the last year and some change. And so one of the ways that I've been doing that is looking back at stuff that I've written last year. So that was one of the cool things about last year, is that I did have the opportunity to write in a lot of different ways, whether it was through the Kingsport Times News or eventually then in January of this year starting the website. But to look back over things that I wrote and see how my experiences in the world, like in my life, came through in my writing and came through in how I was understanding and experiencing, whether it was scripture or some kind of idea, and how I tied those two together. And so I shared today on my blog this post that I wrote in June 2020. It was for the Holston Conference, which I'm a United Methodist pastor, and so it was for the Holston Conference Daily Devotional, which is like our denominational regional group. So this was June 2020. I wrote about this passage in Acts 7, verses 37 through 39, in which Stephen, the first martyr in the early church, is speaking to the assembled Sanhedrin and religious leaders, and he's taking them through the history of Israel. And in Acts 7, this particular part, he comes to this place. I'm just going to read it because I think that'll be pretty helpful. He says, "This is the Moses," he's talking about Moses, "who told the Israelites, 'God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your own people.' He was in the assembly, the gathering in the wilderness, with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai and with our ancestors, and he received living words to pass on to us. But our ancestors refused to obey him, and so they rejected him and, in their hearts, turned back to Egypt." And so what I write about in this post, this devotional that I wrote for the conference, was about how that idea that, like, in their hearts, the people of Israel turned back to Egypt. I mean, we see it in the Exodus story. It's pretty fascinating. They were slaves in Egypt. I mean, they were slaves. They were not free. And yet once they're then freed and brought across the Red Sea and moving towards the Promised Land, I mean, they do experience hardship in this wilderness, this transitional space between where they were, that was an objectively bad place. I mean, they were slaves, and between where they were going, which would be objectively a good place. I mean, the place of freedom, the literal and archetypal promised land. That's where they were going to. But in between this transitional place, in this literal desert, they were faced with a lot of challenges. I mean, lack of food, lack of water, lack of clarity, lack of purpose, a lot of confusion and a lot of chaos in that place. And one of the things that's so interesting is how often the people of Israel rebel and against Moses' leadership and ultimately against God's leadership, but how they then turn that to say, like, oh, if only we could go back to Egypt. If only we could go back to Egypt, and things were so good in Egypt. We had food there. I mean, yeah, we weren't free, but at least we had food and water, and we knew what was coming tomorrow. And I think, part of the reason this resonated with me in June was because, you look at the world existentially, and so much of what was happening in June 2020 was that we were in this transitional space where we knew what was before, and we hoped eventually we'd get to the promised land, right? We'd get to the other side of this pandemic, but we didn't know where we were in the middle. And there's so much confusion, so much chaos. And I think what I felt, what really touched a chord with me was, in their hearts, they turned back to Egypt. It's this idea that they thought they knew what they were going back to, but the reality is that, like, what they left behind, Egypt, didn't exist anymore. And not only did it not exist anymore, but it perhaps never existed at all. It was just where they were in that moment, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. This image that they had framed of Egypt didn't actually exist, right? So what they were saying they were going to go back to, it was an illusion. And I think so many of us in life, we experience that, right? Where we're in this transitional place of waiting between what was maybe bad or what was painful or hurtful or an experience of our past and moving into the future. And in that transitional place, we're so tempted to say, like, oh, well, yeah, that wasn't great, but at least we can go back there. And we tend to romanticize that which was painful or hurtful or just objectively bad for us. And what's very difficult is that sometimes we do go back to that, when in reality that's not how. All we're doing is returning to slavery. When the call and the invitation of God is to move forward into the unknown, to trust him in that process and to move forward into that place of where he will ultimately be the one who brings us into freedom and purpose and wholeness and life. It's just an interesting thing, but I think for me, part of why this is really interesting and why it's interesting for me to go back and to look at it is because I know like what was going on in my own life at this time. I mean, in June 2020, I was coming on the backside of an unexpected divorce process, and so trying to make sense of all that, trying to figure out how do I explain things to my girls that like I can't really explain to myself, trying to make sense of what my personal world looked like in the midst of this like larger existential global cultural crisis of meaning and of purpose and of like and then on top of everything else, if you think back to last summer, I mean the racial injustices, the murder of George Floyd in May, the protests and everything that was coming out of that, the run up to the election in the fall. I mean, there was a lot going on last summer. And so I think that's part of why I was kind of drawn into that particular place of thinking about this waiting in between period. And so I just think that's interesting. I think it's helpful for me to go back and to reflect on it. I mean, just personally, right? Because in that place, I found this to be true for my own life, that what I wrote about was something that was actually very personal and personally very helpful to me, that I knew like in June 2020, there's no going back. I mean, there's no going back to the marriage that I thought I had, but maybe I didn't. There's no going back to the life that I thought existed, but clearly doesn't anymore, and perhaps never existed in the way that in my mind I perceived it to exist. There's also like kind of, existentially, right, and vocationally, there's no going back to the church that existed, but that perhaps really didn't exist. No going back to the world that we thought existed, but maybe was just something of an illusion, right? That what happened in a lot of ways in the pandemic was that it revealed a lot of things that were beneath the surface. Whether we saw that come out like with racism or different issues, we saw things rise up to the surface that were there the whole time, but that were not visible. So all that to say, you can find that post, stevehopkins.online. I'll actually link to that in the comment or in the content of this post. You can find that there. But as ever, if y'all need anything, do reach out. Let me know how I can help and be of service to you. Hey, y'all have a great day, and we'll see you around.